The dust on Old Man Vance's boots wasn't just dust. It was the history of the High Valley, a fine reddish silt that had settled into the very fibers of his being, as deeply ingrained as the scent of pine and sage that clung to his worn denim. Ethan Vance, though far from an old man at 42, carried the weight of generations in his shoulders and the wisdom of the land in his eyes. He wasn't just a rancher. He was of this ranch, the Triple V, a sprawling 3,000 acres nestled in a forgotten pocket of Colorado, where the Rockies began their lazy sprawl into the plains, a place where the air tasted cleaner and the silence was often punctuated only by the cries of hawks circling overhead. The Triple V wasn't merely land. It was a living archive, a testament to the Vances who'd tamed it since the 1880s. Their sweat and grit etched into every fence post, every gnarled juniper, and every ripple of the winding creek that carved its way through the property. The weathered lines on the main farmhouse, built by his great-grandfather, told stories of blizzards and droughts, of lean years and bountiful harvests. For Ethan, this place was more than property. It was his inheritance, his responsibility, and the very core of his identity. For Ethan, the ranch was sanctuary. It was where he shed the suit and tie, the clipped precision of federal regulations, the high-stakes negotiations over disputed territories, and the often grim realities of environmental crimes. Here, under the vast, boundless sky, he wore faded jeans, a worn denim shirt, and a Stetson that seemed to mold itself to the contours of his thoughts, absorbing the sun and the silent contemplation of his days. Here, he could breathe the thin, crisp air, listen to the whisper of the wind through the pines, and feel the solid, unyielding earth beneath his feet. A stark contrast to the shifting sands of bureaucracy and the often treacherous terrain of human nature he navigated daily in his other life. The solitude was a balm, a necessary antidote to the constant vigilance and psychological demands of his clandestine profession. He was a federal land agent, a quiet, unassuming man with an extraordinary job that most people could never imagine. His official title was Special Agent with the Bureau of Land Management's Office of Law Enforcement and Security. Most people pictured smiling park rangers handing out brochures or friendly Forest Service workers clearing trails when they thought of federal land. They didn't picture someone with a badge, a concealed firearm, a keen eye for detail, and the legal authority to investigate everything from illegal mining operations and large-scale timber theft to ancient artifact looting, wildlife trafficking, and complex multi-state land fraud schemes. His cases were complex, often requiring months, sometimes years, of meticulous investigation, a demanding blend of forensic accounting, deep environmental science, advanced surveillance techniques, and old-fashioned detective work. His jurisdiction was vast, encompassing millions of acres of public lands across the western United States. A breathtaking mosaic of arid deserts, sprawling forests, towering mountains, and vital river systems that were, in their own way, as wild and untamed as the sophisticated criminals and greedy corporations who sometimes tried to exploit them for illicit gain. He had faced down armed squatters, navigated treacherous legal loopholes designed to obscure illicit dealings, and spent weeks living in remote, harsh environments, all in the service of protecting America's natural heritage. But here, at the Triple V, he was just Ethan Vance, the rancher, the solitary figure who kept to himself, who knew the land like the back of his calloused hand, reading the subtle signs of weather in the clouds and the needs of his small herd in their lowing calls. His biggest concerns seemed to be repairing the aging irrigation system that dated back to his grandfather's time, mending a section of dilapidated fence, or tending to his small but hardy herd of resilient longhorns whose shaggy coats and impressive horns were a familiar sight against the backdrop of the hills. This carefully cultivated normalcy was not merely a preference, it was essential. His work often involved sensitive operations, confidential informants whose lives could be at risk, and dangerous individuals who operated outside the law and would stop at nothing to protect their illicit gains. Maintaining a low profile, being just another unassuming face in the rural landscape, was a crucial part of his operational security. No one in the small, tight-knit community of High Valley knew the full extent of his duties, not even his closest neighbors, though they might have harbored quiet suspicions about his frequent unexplained absences or the occasional high-tech gadget glimpsed in his truck. They simply respected his privacy, a courtesy he readily extended in return. The Triple V, however, was suddenly under siege, not by cunning cattle rustlers or brazen environmental criminals, but by something far more insidious and, in its own way, equally threatening: the Westview Heights Homeowners Association. The Westview Heights development had sprung up 5 years ago, a rash of cookie-cutter McMansions and meticulously manicured lawns on what used to be prime grazing land bordering the eastern edge of the Triple V. It was the brainchild of Sterling Developments, a company known for its aggressive expansion, its ruthless efficiency, and its president, Brenda Sterling. Brenda, a woman whose perfectly coiffed blonde hair, immaculately manicured nails, and impeccably tailored designer suits screamed urban sprawl, was the current, self-appointed queen of the Westview Heights HOA. She'd descended upon High Valley like a monarch surveying her newly acquired kingdom, bringing with her not just a rule book, but an entire army of rules, regulations, and a rigid vision of suburban uniformity that clashed violently with the wild, untamed spirit of the land and the independent nature of its long-standing residents. Her arrival marked a distinct shift in the valley's demographics and its unspoken social contracts. Ethan had initially dismissed the HOA as a minor annoyance, a bureaucratic nuisance he could easily circumvent or ignore. He'd signed a few forms, paid some nominal fees, mostly out of a sense of good neighborliness and a desire to avoid unnecessary friction. The Triple V, due to a quirk in its original platting and its unique historical designation as an active ranch, was technically included within the broader Westview Heights master plan, though it was meant to be an unincorporated natural preserve area within it. Or so he thought. The developers, Sterling Developments, had explicitly promised in signed documents and verbal assurances that the ranch's unique status would be respected, that it would remain a natural buffer, a piece of authentic Old West, untouched by the HOA's draconian covenants. Lies, as it turned out, were just as prevalent and expertly spun in the high-stakes world of real estate development as they were in the complex land fraud cases he routinely investigated. Brenda Sterling, however, had a fundamentally different interpretation of the Triple V's role within her burgeoning empire. To her, the Triple V was an eyesore, a blight on her perfectly manicured suburban dreamscape. Its wild native grasses, allowed to grow naturally for grazing, its weathered, unpainted barns that had stood for over a century, the genuine working machinery, a rusty but reliable tractor, a vintage hay baler. It all offended her sensibilities, her vision of pristine, homogeneous perfection. She envisioned rows of identical, freshly painted homes, symmetrical green lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and identical mailboxes, all contributing to a unified, controlled aesthetic. The Triple V, with its rugged individuality, its unapologetic authenticity, its very existence as a working ranch, disrupted her meticulously planned tableau. It was a fly in her perfectly crafted ointment. Her right-hand man, Richard Thompson, was a sniveling opportunist, a real estate agent who'd made a small fortune selling the Westview Heights properties. His success directly tied to the expansion and perceived upscale image of the development. He was Brenda's echo, her sycophantic enforcer, a man who saw the world in dollar signs and perceived anything that couldn't be capitalized upon as a personal affront to his meticulously built financial empire. He was the one who delivered the increasingly terse notices, his smug face a constant reminder of the encroaching threat, a physical embodiment of the relentless pressure they were applying. His oily charm masked a deep-seated contempt for anything rustic or unrefined. The first notices were subtle, almost laughable in their absurdity. Notice of non-compliance, excessive native grass growth. Please trim or replace with approved turf. Ethan had read it, chuckled, and tossed it into the burn barrel, watching it curl into ash. He wasn't growing turf. He was raising cattle, and native grasses were essential for his herd. Unauthorized livestock activity. Your cattle are creating an unsanitary environment. That one he'd actually pinned to the barn door as a joke for his longhorns, who eyed it with bovine indifference. Then came the fines. Small at first, $100 here, $200 there. He ignored them, considering them frivolous, irrelevant, and utterly without legal standing given the original agreements. He had more pressing matters to attend to, like tracking a timber poacher in the Flathead National Forest. But Brenda Sterling was nothing if not persistent and relentlessly single-minded. She saw his inaction not as a logical dismissal of absurd demands, but as blatant defiance, his quiet demeanor as weakness, an invitation to press harder. "Mr. Vance," she'd said once, cornering him at the local hardware store, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that couldn't quite conceal the underlying steel. "We're simply trying to bring Westview Heights into a cohesive, high-value community. Your property, it frankly detracts from that. It lowers everyone's property values." Ethan had simply tipped his worn Stetson, his eyes unreadable pools of calm. "My property's been here 140 years, ma'am. High value's always been its nature. It's a working ranch, not a decorative lawn ornament." She'd bristled visibly, her perfectly manicured hands clenching into fists, but he'd simply walked away, leaving her fuming amidst the bags of potting soil and garden tools, a vision of urban frustration against a rural backdrop. His life as a federal agent required a certain detachment, an ability to assess threats and navigate complex situations without revealing his hand. He applied the same calm, analytical approach to the HOA, though a simmering frustration began to churn beneath his stoic exterior. He dealt with hardened criminals, armed poachers, shrewd developers trying to pull off multi-million-dollar scams, and corrupt local officials. But this petty tyranny, this relentless assault on his home and heritage by a group of suburban busybodies, was almost more irritating than any of his professional challenges. It was an affront to his home, his family's legacy, and everything he held sacred. It felt deeply personal, almost like a violation. He was currently deep into a complex, high-profile land fraud case involving a powerful timber consortium attempting to illegally log protected old-growth forests on federal land in Montana. It was an investigation that demanded his full attention, leaving him with little time for domestic squabbles. His days were a blur of encrypted communications with his handlers, painstaking satellite imagery analysis to identify illegal logging roads, and covert meetings with informants deep in the wilderness. His nights, when he was home, were spent reviewing surveillance footage from remote trail cameras and poring over complex property deeds, tracing labyrinthine ownership paths back to the shadowy figures pulling the strings. The last thing he needed was a suburban tyrant telling him his grass was too long or that his barn, a historical landmark, didn't fit her aesthetic. Yet, the HOA's aggression was escalating with alarming speed and audacity. He found new notices, increasingly threatening in tone, stapled to his gate almost daily. Violation, unapproved exterior paint color, barn. Immediate remediation required. The barn was over a century old, its wood weathered to a natural gray and silver, a color born of sun, wind, and countless seasons, not a paint can. It was beautiful in its rugged authenticity. Infraction, non-conforming agricultural equipment, visible from public roadway, remove immediately. His tractor, for crying out loud. The very tool of his livelihood without which the ranch could not operate. It was a thinly veiled attempt to choke his ability to run the Triple V as a working ranch. He began to notice subtle shifts in the community's demeanor. Neighbors who once waved a friendly greeting now averted their gaze, their expressions tinged with discomfort or even suspicion. Whispers followed him in town, hushed conversations that ceased abruptly when he approached. Brenda Sterling had successfully branded him as the difficult one, the uncooperative rancher, the obstacle holding back progress and lowering everyone's property values. It was a familiar tactic of bullies and manipulators. Isolate your target, turn the community against them, make them feel alone and powerless. Ethan, however, was no stranger to isolation. His work often required him to operate alone, trusting only his instincts and the cold, hard facts uncovered through painstaking investigation. He started to feel the familiar itch of an emerging investigation. Was this just Brenda Sterling's outsized ego and control fetish? Or was there something more substantial, more nefarious, behind this relentless pursuit of his ranch? He had a bad feeling in his gut, a subtle tremor that echoed the warning bells that always rang when he was on the cusp of uncovering something truly rotten, something that went beyond simple HOA grievances. He knew the signs of a coordinated predatory operation when he saw them. But Brenda Sterling was nothing if not persistent and relentlessly single-minded. She saw his inaction not as a logical dismissal of absurd demands, but as blatant defiance, his quiet demeanor as weakness, an invitation to press harder. "Mr. Vance," she'd said once, cornering him at the local hardware store, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that couldn't quite conceal the underlying steel. "We're simply trying to bring Westview Heights into a cohesive, high-value community. Your property, it frankly detracts from that. It lowers everyone's property values." Ethan had simply tipped his worn Stetson, his eyes unreadable pools of calm. "My property's been here 140 years, ma'am. High value's always been its nature. It's a working ranch, not a decorative lawn ornament. She'd bristled visibly, her perfectly manicured hands clenching into fists, but he'd simply walked away, leaving her fuming amidst the bags of potting soil and garden tools, a vision of urban frustration against a rural backdrop. His life as a federal agent required a certain detachment, an ability to assess threats and navigate complex situations without revealing his hand. He applied the same calm, analytical approach to the HOA, though a simmering frustration began to churn beneath his stoic exterior. He dealt with hardened criminals, armed poachers, shrewd developers trying to pull off multi-million-dollar scams, and corrupt local officials. But this petty tyranny, this relentless assault on his home and heritage by a group of suburban busybodies, was almost more irritating than any of his professional challenges. It was an affront to his home, his family's legacy, and everything he held sacred. It felt deeply personal, almost like a violation. He was currently deep into a complex, high-profile land fraud case involving a powerful timber consortium attempting to illegally log protected old-growth forests on federal land in Montana. It was an investigation that demanded his full attention, leaving him with little time for domestic squabbles. His days were a blur of encrypted communications with his handlers, painstaking satellite imagery analysis to identify illegal logging roads, and covert meetings with informants deep in the wilderness. His nights, when he was home, were spent reviewing surveillance footage from remote trail cameras and poring over complex property deeds, tracing labyrinthine ownership paths back to the shadowy figures pulling the strings. The last thing he needed was a suburban tyrant telling him his grass was too long or that his barn, a historical landmark, didn't fit her aesthetic. Yet, the HOA's aggression was escalating with alarming speed and audacity. He found new notices, increasingly threatening in tone, stapled to his gate almost daily. Violation, unapproved exterior paint color, barn. Immediate remediation required. The barn was over a century old, its wood weathered to a natural gray and silver, a color born of sun, wind, and countless seasons, not a paint can. It was beautiful in its rugged authenticity. Infraction, non-conforming agricultural equipment, visible from public roadway, remove immediately. His tractor, for crying out loud. The very tool of his livelihood without which the ranch could not operate. It was a thinly veiled attempt to choke his ability to run the Triple V as a working ranch. He began to notice subtle shifts in the community's demeanor. Neighbors who once waved a friendly greeting now averted their gaze, their expressions tinged with discomfort or even suspicion. Whispers followed him in town, hushed conversations that ceased abruptly when he approached. Brenda Sterling had successfully branded him as the difficult one, the uncooperative rancher, the obstacle holding back progress and lowering everyone's property values. It was a familiar tactic of bullies and manipulators. Isolate your target, turn the community against them, make them feel alone and powerless. Ethan, however, was no stranger to isolation. His work often required him to operate alone, trusting only his instincts and the cold, hard facts uncovered through painstaking investigation. He started to feel the familiar itch of an emerging investigation. Was this just Brenda Sterling's outsized ego and control fetish? Or was there something more substantial, more nefarious, behind this relentless pursuit of his ranch? He had a bad feeling in his gut, a subtle tremor that echoed the warning bells that always rang when he was on the cusp of uncovering something truly rotten, something that went beyond simple HOA grievances. He knew the signs of a coordinated predatory operation when he saw them. He was a man who understood the intrinsic value of land, its resources, its history, and its delicate ecosystems. And he knew with chilling certainty that people often tried to take what wasn't theirs through deceit, manipulation, or brute force. He just never thought it would come from a homeowners association. The audacity of it, the sheer petty tyranny, was almost comical if it weren't so gravely threatening to his home and his family's legacy. He had to put a stop to it, and he knew exactly how to do it. The morning started with the familiar scent of brewing coffee, strong and black, and the distant, comforting lowing of his longhorns, their calls echoing softly across the valley. But it ended with a new, sharper tang of indignation and a cold knot in Ethan's stomach. A legal summons. Not just another absurd fine, not just a notice of non-compliance to be ignored or mocked, but a formal notice of intent to foreclose on lien and pursue judicial eviction. The document, thick and riddled with dense, impenetrable legal jargon, stated in no uncertain terms that due to outstanding and accumulating fines totaling over $15,000, the Westview Heights HOA was initiating proceedings to place a lien on the Triple V Ranch, and subsequently, if the fines remained unpaid, to foreclose on that lien and force a sale of the property. Brenda Sterling wasn't just playing petty games anymore. She was playing for keeps, and the stakes were nothing less than his family's heritage. Her signature, bold and aggressively looping, seemed to mock him from the bottom of the page, a triumphant flourish. Richard Thompson had personally delivered it, driving his gleaming black SUV right up to the farmhouse, his face a mask of feigned solemnity and thinly veiled smug satisfaction as he handed the envelope over, pretending to be apologetic. "Just doing my job, Mr. Vance," he'd simpered, lingering a moment too long, his eyes greedily scanning the vast, untouched acreage. "It's a shame, really. Such a beautiful piece of land. A shame it's being underutilized." He accented the word underutilized with a subtle sneer, clearly implying that the ranch was wasting valuable development potential by remaining a ranch. Underutilized. The word grated on Ethan like sandpaper over raw nerves. His family had nurtured this land for generations, had bled and sweat and sacrificed to make it productive, to keep it wild, to maintain its delicate ecological balance. It was a working ranch, a vibrant ecosystem, a living testament to a way of life, not a manicured golf course or a sterile suburban park to be paved over for more identical houses. Brenda Sterling's definition of utilization was, no doubt, paving it over for more cookie-cutter houses and asphalt. The very thought made his blood run cold, a cold, analytical calm born of years of high-pressure investigations settled over Ethan. This wasn't just personal anymore, not in the way Brenda Sterling wanted it to be. A simple squabble with a stubborn resident. This was a clear, tangible threat to his home, yes, but it was also a fascinating, intricate puzzle. A full-blown case demanding his professional expertise. The familiar gears of his federal agent mind, sharp and relentless, began to turn with renewed focus. He had always kept his professional life rigidly separate from his personal one, a necessary partition for operational security and his own mental well-being. But now, the lines were irrevocably blurring, and a part of him, the part that investigated organized land grabs and sophisticated environmental crimes, was not just frustrated, but intrigued. This felt like a smaller, more intimate version of the larger battles he fought daily. He spread the voluminous documents out on his ancient kitchen table, pushing aside a stack of aerial maps from his ongoing Montana timber fraud case. The HOA's actions were textbook, a classic predatory sequence: harass, fine, escalate, lien, foreclose. It was a depressingly common tactic used by unscrupulous developers and land speculators to acquire desirable parcels for pennies on the dollar, leveraging legal loopholes and financial pressure to dispossess smaller landowners. Was Brenda Sterling merely an overly zealous, power-hungry HOA president? Or was she a pawn, or perhaps even a mastermind in something bigger, more organized? His gut told him it was the latter. His first move wasn't to call a lawyer, not yet. He had a better, more direct way of investigating. His first move was to tap into resources Brenda Sterling didn't even know existed, tools that could peel back layers of corporate obfuscation and expose hidden agendas. He started with public records, but not just local ones easily accessible at the county clerk's office. He ran the Westview Heights HOA through federal databases, cross-referencing names, addresses, corporate registrations, and looking for any red flags, past litigation, environmental impact statements for nearby projects, federal grants awarded to seemingly unrelated entities, anything that might connect them to larger, more significant land dealings or individuals with a history of questionable practices. He meticulously cross-referenced sterling developments with known players in the aggressive land acquisition game, entities notorious for their hostile takeovers and legal battles. His secure home office, usually reserved for his complex federal work, with its multiple monitors and encrypted network access, quickly became his primary war room against the HOA. He set up covert surveillance on the HOA office in Westview Heights, a small modern building adjacent to the community clubhouse. Nothing illegal, of course, just passive observation. He noted who came and went, the regularity of Brenda and Richard's meetings, the types of vehicles associated with the board members, identifying patterns and anomalies. He even started attending HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back row, blending into the background, observing the dynamics, listening to the subtle nuances of conversation, and cataloging the unspoken resentments simmering among the residents. He was no longer just a disgruntled resident. He was an agent on a preliminary inquiry, gathering intelligence. The meetings themselves were a carefully choreographed farce. Brenda Sterling dominated the proceedings, silencing dissent with practiced ease, her every pronouncement backed by Richard Thompson's sycophantic nodding and exaggerated affirmations. The escalating fines against Ethan were always prominently displayed on the financial reports, making him out to be a scofflaw, a drain on the community's precious resources, and a danger to their collective property values. Other residents, either cowed by Brenda's authoritarian demeanor or simply uninterested in the minutiae of HOA politics, remained silent, nodding along to her pronouncements. But Ethan, with his trained eye for human behavior, noticed a few faces. An elderly couple, the Millers, who always looked worried and occasionally exchanged uneasy glances, and a young family, the Chengs, who seemed perpetually frustrated and occasionally tried to voice hesitant concerns, only to be smoothly shut down by Brenda's practiced deflection techniques. These were the residents who might, with a little prompting, become allies. He began to dig deeper into the HOA's finances, moving beyond the surface-level public records. The officially declared public records were sparse and deliberately vague, but a few glaring discrepancies jumped out at him. The HOA's annual budget showed unusually high line items for consulting fees and legal expenditures that seemed wildly disproportionate to the size and apparent needs of the community. He started comparing their declared income from homeowner dues to the actual assessed values of the properties and the reported dues, as well as the number of homes. There was a significant discrepancy, not massive enough to immediately trigger an audit by a casual observer, but enough to raise a very suspicious eyebrow for a seasoned investigator. Then he started looking at the original land acquisition for Westview Heights itself. Who owned the land before Sterling Developments acquired it? He found a complex, almost indecipherable series of interconnected shell corporations, a common tactic for obscuring true ownership and money trails in illicit dealings. He traced them back, slowly, painstakingly, using public records, his specialized federal software, and a network of contacts in corporate finance. It was like peeling an onion, layer by layer, each one revealing another hidden connection. He discovered that the original land for Westview Heights had been purchased from an obscure holding company that had, in turn, acquired it from a struggling rancher during a tough economic downturn. The price paid by the holding company seemed suspiciously low, almost a distressed sale, suggesting coercion or inside information. What raised a bigger red flag was that this obscure holding company had direct ties, tenuous but undeniably traceable, to a much larger national real estate conglomerate with a long history of aggressive, even predatory land acquisitions across several states, often involving properties adjacent to federal lands. And Brenda Sterling, it turned out, had a significant, cleverly concealed financial interest in that conglomerate through a seemingly innocuous trust fund. Richard Thompson also had substantial undisclosed commissions tied not just to individual property sales, but to the total revenue generated by the entire Westview Heights development, including potential future phases. The more houses, the more revenue, and the more amenities they could sell, the more Richard earned, providing a powerful incentive for expansion at any cost. His suspicions solidified into a chilling theory. Brenda Sterling wasn't just trying to enforce petty HOA rules for aesthetic reasons. She was actively trying to consolidate control, perhaps even acquire the Triple V by leveraging the HOA's power and the threat of legal foreclosure. Why? To simply expand Westview Heights directly? Or more likely, to flip it for a much larger profit to that national conglomerate she was connected to, as a strategic parcel for a massive multi-phase development, or for linking up other parcels for an even larger single-entity sale that could command a staggering price. The Triple V, with its size, its natural resources, and its strategic location bordering existing federal lands, would be a goldmine for further, much larger development, potentially disrupting fragile ecosystems and historical pathways. He compiled his findings into a meticulously organized, cross-referenced file, a digital dossier complete with financial statements, detailed corporate ownership diagrams, sworn affidavits, if he could get them, and a precise timeline of events, all encrypted and backed up. He didn't want to alert his agency just yet. This was still, technically, a personal matter, albeit one where his professional skills were proving indispensable. But if it escalated to the point of needing formal federal intervention, if Brenda Sterling pushed him too far, he'd have all his ducks in a row, a watertight case ready to present. The HOA's pressure intensified, becoming increasingly brazen and malicious. They sent a crew to trim his native grasses down to stubble, a blatant act of trespassing and destruction of property, which he documented meticulously with time-stamped photos and video. They put up imposing "no trespassing" private property signs on his own perimeter fence, facing into his ranch, implying he was the intruder, a psychological tactic of gaslighting and intimidation. He found his water lines mysteriously cut, requiring him to call a plumber, only to find the cuts were precise, almost surgical, suggesting deliberate sabotage rather than accidental damage. Vandalism, he realized. But proving it definitively without revealing his hand would be difficult for a civilian. He consulted with a trusted, off-the-books contact, Sarah Chen, a former colleague from his BLM days who now ran a highly respected private investigative firm specializing in corporate fraud. He presented her with the anonymized details of the HOA's financials and the web of shell corporations, asking for her seasoned opinion on the financial irregularities. Sarah, sharp as ever, confirmed his gravest suspicions. "Ethan," she'd said, her voice grim over the secure line, "this HOA looks less like a community association and more like a carefully constructed front for a hostile takeover. These consulting fees are classic kickbacks designed to funnel money to specific individuals, and the legal expenditures, probably silencing previous dissenters or paying off local officials to smooth the way. These people are operating far outside the spirit, if not the letter, of the law. They're building a legal framework for theft." The pieces began to fall into place with chilling clarity, forming a disturbing mosaic of corporate greed, orchestrated deception, and petty tyranny. The eviction notice, once a source of simmering anger and frustration, now became a pivotal point. The lever Brenda Sterling thought she had to control him, to force him to sell. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. She had tried to evict a rancher, a man who loved his land. She was about to discover she had tangled with a federal land agent, a man whose job it was to protect the land and who didn't just let go when he smelled a rat. He tracked it, cornered it, and exposed it for all to see. His quiet demeanor was a carefully constructed shield, his patience a honed weapon. The air in the Westview Heights Community Center, usually filled with the polite chatter of suburban grievances, was thick with palpable anticipation, a nervous, almost electric hum that vibrated through the polished linoleum floor. It was the annual HOA meeting, a seemingly mundane civic duty, but everyone present knew it was more than that. It was the day Brenda Sterling, in her meticulously planned ascendancy, intended to finalize the fate of the Triple V Ranch, to make an example of Ethan Vance and cement her unchallenged authority. The notice of intent to foreclose had been circulated widely throughout the community, meticulously framed by Brenda as a necessary, regrettable, but ultimately vital step to protect the financial integrity and aesthetic harmony of Westview Heights. It was a declaration of war, and she expected a surrender. Ethan Vance sat in the back row, as always, a quiet, almost invisible observer. He was dressed in a simple, dark shirt and jeans, looking no different from any other rancher who might grudgingly attend such a meeting. But today, his usual calm was merely a veneer, a thin skin over a coiled spring of controlled energy and focused intent. He wasn't just observing, he was preparing for a tactical strike, the culmination of weeks of relentless investigation and strategic planning. His worn leather satchel, resting casually on the chair beside him, wasn't just carrying mundane documents. It was a carefully assembled arsenal of irrefutable facts, damning figures, and incontrovertible evidence, each piece meticulously documented and cross-referenced. Brenda Sterling, resplendent and radiating an aura of self-importance in a vibrant cerulean power suit that perfectly matched her expensive handbag, stood at the podium. A triumphant, almost predatory smile was plastered on her perfectly made-up face, a mask of unassailable confidence. Richard Thompson sat beside her, meticulously arranging papers, his eyes darting around the room, nervously but smugly, scanning the faces of the residents before settling for a moment on Ethan with a familiar predatory glint. Other HOA board members, mostly silent puppets selected for their docility, occupied the chairs behind them, their expressions ranging from passive agreement to barely concealed discomfort. "Good evening, esteemed residents of Westview Heights," Brenda began, her voice modulated to sound both authoritative and reassuring, yet carrying an undercurrent of unyielding resolve. "As you all know, our community thrives on adherence to our carefully crafted covenants, ensuring not just property values, but a consistent, desirable lifestyle for every homeowner. Unfortunately, we have a persistent issue, a glaring anomaly that has reached a critical juncture and demands our collective attention." She paused dramatically, letting the implication hang in the suddenly tense air, allowing her audience to internalize the perceived threat. Her gaze, sharp and unblinking as a hawk's, landed directly on Ethan, a silent challenge in her eyes. "Mr. Ethan Vance, owner of the adjacent Triple V Ranch, has repeatedly, and with deliberate disregard, violated our established regulations. Despite numerous attempts at communication, escalating warnings, and accumulating fines, Mr. Vance has steadfastly refused to comply. His property, with its non-conforming aesthetics and agricultural activities, remains an anomaly, impacting the very fabric of our community's appeal and the financial investment of us all." A low murmur went through the crowded room. Some residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the underlying aggression. A few, already swayed by Brenda's carefully constructed narrative, nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern for their property values and a desire for harmony. The Millers, the elderly couple, looked down at their laps, their faces etched with a familiar mixture of sympathy for Ethan and fear for themselves. The Chengs, the young family, exchanged frustrated glances, their earlier attempts to question Brenda's authority having been met with dismissive retorts. "Therefore," Brenda continued, her voice hardening, losing its veneer of sweetness and revealing the steel beneath, "the board has unanimously voted to proceed with the judicial foreclosure of the lien placed on the Triple V Ranch. This is not a decision we take lightly, by any means, but it is necessary to protect the collective investment of every homeowner present today. We cannot allow one dissenting individual to undermine the prosperity of the entire community." Richard Thompson, sensing his cue, stood up, holding a stack of glossy full-color brochures. He held them aloft like sacred texts. "And once the property is legally acquired by the HOA," he announced, his voice booming with forced enthusiasm that verged on theatrical, sterling developments, in conjunction with a prestigious national investment group, has already expressed significant interest in redeveloping the Triple V land into Phase 3 of Westview Heights, a state-of-the-art residential expansion featuring an executive golf course, a new community center, and hundreds of additional luxury homes. This will, of course, significantly boost all our property values, making Westview Heights the premier address in the entire valley. A palpable wave of excitement rippled through a significant segment of the audience. Promises of increased property values, exclusive luxury amenities, and an elevated community status. It was the bait they'd been conditioned to swallow, the dream they had bought into. Many residents began to whisper excitedly among themselves, imagining the windfall. Brenda beamed, basking in the manufactured applause and murmurs of approval. We will now open the floor for questions before we move to a final vote to affirm the board's decision to proceed with this vital step for our community's future. A few pre-selected residents, strategically placed and clearly coached, offered softball questions, allowing Brenda and Richard to reiterate their points, to paint Ethan as the intransigent villain, the obstructionist, the one standing in the way of collective prosperity. Ethan watched, his expression remaining utterly unreadable, a picture of calm inscrutability. He waited for his moment, the precise psychological and tactical instant to unleash his carefully prepared counterattack. Finally, the moment came. "Any further questions or comments from the floor?" Brenda asked, her eyes scanning the room, expecting silence, a clear path to her triumphant vote. Ethan slowly, deliberately raised his hand. His movement was almost imperceptible, yet it drew every eye in the room. Brenda's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a thin, almost imperceptible line of irritation. Richard Thompson's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing in annoyance. "Mr. Vance," Brenda said, her voice laced with thinly veiled exasperation, "do you finally wish to concede and discuss a settlement that will allow us to move forward?" It was less a question and more a demand for submission. Ethan rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate, unhurried, yet imbued with an unmistakable sense of purpose. He walked, not to the microphone where others had spoken, but slowly, deliberately, to the very front of the room, stopping directly in front of the podium, commanding the space. He placed his worn leather satchel on the table with a soft thud, unclipped it, and began to pull out a series of large, professionally printed charts, graphs, and meticulously organized documents, each one crisply laminated. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the suddenly hushed room. "For months now," Ethan began, his voice calm, clear, and possessing a quiet authority that effortlessly carried across the room, cutting through the lingering tension, "this HOA, under your leadership, Ms. Sterling, has engaged in a calculated and concerted campaign of harassment, intimidation, and meticulously planned legal maneuvers against my family's ancestral land. You've levied frivolous fines based on fabricated violations, orchestrated blatant acts of vandalism, and now you attempt to seize a property that has been in my family for over 140 years, under the transparent guise of community harmony and property value enhancement." Brenda's face began to flush, a dark crimson rising from her perfectly tailored collar. She opened her mouth to interrupt. "Mr. Vance, this is highly inappropriate. We are here to discuss a lawful process." "Oh, it's a process, all right," Ethan interjected smoothly, his voice cutting through hers with quiet power. He held up a large, clearly labeled chart. It was a detailed forensic financial analysis of the HOA's budget. But I question its lawfulness, Ms. Sterling. Deeply. He pointed to a prominent section labeled Consulting Fees, highlighted in stark red. Over the past 3 years, these fees, supposedly for advisory services, have ballooned by over 400%, totaling nearly $500,000 of homeowner dues. Curiously, the vast majority of these fees have gone to a single obscure shell corporation, High Plains Advisory Group. He then displayed another chart, a complex diagram showing the intricate, deliberately convoluted web of ownership of High Plains Advisory Group, which I discovered through diligent research is majority owned by a series of holding companies with direct, undeniable ties to Sterling Developments, specifically to a cleverly concealed trust fund held in your name, Ms. Sterling, and managed by your personal financial advisor. A collective gasp ripped through the room. Brenda's eyes widened to saucers. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. A visible bead of sweat trickled down Richard Thompson's temple, leaving a faint streak in his carefully applied bronzer. The other board members looked like deer caught in the blinding glare of headlights, their faces contorted in expressions of shock and dawning horror. And Mr. Thompson, Ethan continued, his gaze, now sharp and unwavering, turning to impale Richard, your commissions, while substantial enough, are not solely tied to individual property sales, are they? They're tied to the total revenue generated by Westview Heights, and that, Mr. Thompson, includes significant undisclosed bonuses for successful large-scale land acquisitions, particularly large parcels that can facilitate further profitable development for your parent company, the national conglomerate that Brenda Sterling has a vested interest in. Your current commission structure effectively incentivizes you to acquire my ranch regardless of the legality or ethics involved. He held up a clearly legible copy of Richard's commission structure, obtained through a series of diligent public record requests and legal maneuvers. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair clattering loudly as it toppled backward. This is slander. You have no right to disseminate private financial information. You're breaking the law. His voice was high-pitched, bordering on panicked. I have every right, Mr. Thompson, Ethan said, his voice now like cold, hard steel, devoid of any hint of the rancher's drawl. He pulled out another document, larger than the rest, unfurling it to reveal a historical plat map of the Triple V Ranch, meticulously overlaid with recent satellite imagery and color-coded federal land designations. You see, the Triple V Ranch, while bordered by Westview Heights, has a unique and profoundly significant historical designation. It's not just private property. It's been informally recognized and cooperatively managed for decades by my family and federal agencies as a vital ecological corridor. It is a critical component of a larger long-term federal land management strategy for the High Valley region, connecting protected wilderness areas and safeguarding endangered species habitats. He paused, letting the full weight of the implication hang in the suddenly, unnervingly silent air. The murmurs had ceased entirely. Every single eye in the room, from the stunned residents to the paralyzed HOA board, was riveted on him, hanging on his every word. You speak of lawfulness, Miss Sterling, Ethan continued, his voice dropping slightly. becoming resonant with a quiet, undeniable authority that sent shivers down spines, a voice of command and deep understanding of the legal landscape. And I assure you, I am intimately familiar with the law, not just local ordinances or HOA covenants, which you have so blatantly manipulated, but federal statutes, laws pertaining to fraud, racketeering, and the protection of lands with federal ecological significance. He reached into his satchel one last time. This time, he didn't pull out a document. He pulled out a worn but undeniably official leather wallet. He opened it, revealing a gleaming gold shield, the kind that spoke of authority and consequence. "My name is Special Agent Ethan Vance," he announced, his voice echoing with crystal clarity in the stunned silence, a voice that carried the weight of the United States government. "Bureau of Land Management, Office of Law Enforcement and Security. For the past 6 months, operating largely off the books and under my own initiative due to the personal nature of the threat, I've been conducting a preliminary investigation into the activities of the Westview Heights HOA, specifically focusing on potential land fraud, systemic misuse of homeowner funds, and the attempted coercive acquisition of private property that, as I've demonstrated, is recognized as a federally sensitive ecological corridor. Such an attempt involving fraudulent means could trigger a host of federal environmental protection statutes and anti-racketeering laws. The shock in the room was absolute, total, and reverberated like a physical blow. Brenda Sterling's face had gone from red to a ghostly, sickly ashen white. Her perfectly coiffed hair suddenly seemed askew, her designer suit limp. Richard Thompson looked as if he was about to vomit, clutching the podium for support, his eyes darting frantically towards the exit. The other board members, their faces mirroring a mixture of disbelief and utter terror, looked like wax figures frozen in place. The residents, those who had silently suffered under Brenda's despotic rule, began to stir, a growing buzz of incredulous excitement replacing the earlier tension and fear. A few even began to clap tentatively, a ripple that quickly swelled into a wave of applause. "The evidence I have compiled," Ethan continued, his gaze unwavering as it locked onto Brenda's terrified eyes, "including detailed financial records, internal communications from your corporate entities, and your explicit, documented attempts to seize a federally sensitive property under false pretenses, will be formally presented to the appropriate federal authorities immediately following this meeting. Your intent to foreclose on my ranch, Ms. Sterling, has just become the central piece of a federal investigation into your own highly questionable and potentially criminal business practices. Your entire operation, it appears, is nothing more than a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association." He then looked at the wider audience, his expression softening slightly, a glimmer of compassion replacing the investigative rigor. "To the residents of Westview Heights, I understand you've been misled, manipulated, and quite frankly, defrauded. I encourage you to review the financial irregularities I've presented here today. The money you've paid in dues, the funds meant for community improvements, has in part been siphoned off into fraudulent consulting fees for Ms. Sterling's personal gain and the enrichment of her associates. And the judicial eviction of my property was nothing more than a thinly veiled criminal attempt to acquire my land for a new development, enriching a select few at your substantial expense." He snapped his satchel shut with a resounding click, the sound echoing like a final decisive gavel. "Consider this meeting adjourned, and consider the investigation officially commenced." Brenda Sterling stood frozen, her mouth agape, her carefully constructed world, built on lies and intimidation, crumbling around her with astonishing speed. Richard Thompson stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control, to offer some pathetic defense, but the authority in the room had irrevocably shifted. Ethan Vance, the quiet rancher they had so foolishly underestimated, had just dropped a bomb of federal proportions, and the fallout, he knew, was going to be monumental, far-reaching, and entirely deserved. The aftermath of Special Agent Ethan Vance's stunning revelation at the Westview Heights HOA meeting was nothing short of a seismic event that sent shockwaves not only through the immediate community but also into the broader real estate and legal circles of the region. The immediate response within the community center was utter chaos, a cathartic explosion of pent-up frustration and righteous anger. Residents, initially stunned into disbelieving silence by the sight of the federal badge, erupted into a cacophony of angry questions, shouts for accountability, and impassioned demands for justice. Brenda Sterling, utterly robbed of her composure, her face a mask of terror and disbelief, stammered incoherent denials, clutching at the podium as if it were her last lifeline. Richard Thompson, pale and sweating profusely, attempted a pathetic, desperate sprint for the exit, only to find himself quickly surrounded and physically restrained by a dozen furious homeowners, their faces contorted in a mixture of anger and betrayal. Ethan, having delivered his decisive, perfectly timed blow, stepped back from the podium, allowing the immediate fallout to consume its architects. He didn't gloat, didn't make a show of it. That wasn't his style, nor was it professional. He was a federal agent, and his job, though initiated personally, was far from over. As the commotion and accusations continued to swirl around the now debunked leadership, he calmly and efficiently pulled out his secure satellite phone. He placed a concise, professional call to his field office, relaying the full details of his personal investigation that had suddenly, dramatically, and undeniably crossed into his professional jurisdiction, now ripe for formal federal prosecution. He requested immediate assistance and emphasized the need for a rapid response to secure evidence and ensure the safety of the now agitated residents. Within what felt like mere hours, the formidable wheels of justice began to turn with a swift, grinding certainty. The meticulous financial evidence Ethan had compiled, combined with his undeniable status as a federal land agent and the gravity of the potential fraud involving federal environmental interests, spurred swift and decisive action. Federal investigators from the BLM's Office of Law Enforcement and Security, along with uniformed local law enforcement, descended upon Westview Heights. The HOA's entire labyrinthine financial records were seized, along with computer servers, hard drives, and all physical documentation. Brenda Sterling and Richard Thompson were formally detained and taken in for extensive questioning, their designer suits and slick appearances now appearing disheveled and pathetic. The initial charges levied against them were significant: multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and various local zoning and environmental infractions related to their attempts to reclassify or coercively acquire federally recognized ecological corridor land. The exorbitant consulting fees were definitively identified as an elaborate system of kickbacks, systematically funneled through the series of shell corporations Ethan had painstakingly uncovered. The relentless pressure they had exerted on other residents, the arbitrary fines, the veiled threats, and the orchestrated vandalism were now viewed through the chilling lens of racketeering and attempted extortion, adding further weight to the federal charges. The national real estate conglomerate, to whom Sterling Developments was loosely affiliated, quickly issued a terse public statement, frantically distancing itself from Brenda and Richard, launching its own internal investigation with great public fanfare. Eager to mitigate the impending public relations disaster and immense legal exposure, their stock took a noticeable dip. The Westview Heights HOA, once an iron fist of authoritarian control, disintegrated almost overnight. Its board members, many of whom claimed genuine ignorance, resigned en masse, some genuinely horrified and distraught by what they had unknowingly been a part of, others simply abandoning a rapidly sinking ship in a desperate attempt to save their own reputations. An interim committee of residents, comprising the greatly relieved Millers, the now empowered Chengs, and several other outspoken community members, was quickly formed to begin the painful but necessary process of rebuilding trust and rectifying the extensive financial damage and legal entanglements. They sought Ethan's advice, not as an HOA member, but as a knowledgeable, trustworthy, and now deeply respected figure. He provided guidance on auditing procedures, legal pathways for recouping lost funds, and steps for establishing a truly democratic and transparent governing body. For Ethan, the Triple V Ranch was finally undeniably safe. The illegitimate lien was immediately dismissed by federal order, and the frivolous fines erased from the records, effectively nullified. The ranch, with its century-old weathered barn, its wild native grasses, and its enduring spirit, was no longer an eyesore, but became a powerful symbol of resilience, a testament to standing firm against overreach and corruption. He worked closely with the newly formed interim HOA to establish clear, mutually respectful boundaries, ensuring the ranch's unique historical, agricultural, and ecological status was officially acknowledged and permanently protected from future predatory development, cementing its place as a vital part of the valley's natural heritage. He even helped them draft new, fair, and equitable covenants that respected individual property rights while genuinely promoting collective community welfare, a stark contrast to Brenda Sterling's tyrannical rule. The revelation of Ethan Vance's true profession spread like wildfire through the entire High Valley and beyond, quickly becoming local legend. Neighbors who had once been wary or avoided his gaze now looked at him with a mixture of profound respect, admiration, and even a touch of awe. The local hardware store owner, who had always just seen him as a quiet, unassuming rancher, now treated him with a newfound deference, offering him the best cuts of lumber and sharing knowing nods. He received heartfelt apologies from those who had judged him unfairly or succumbed to Brenda Sterling's smear campaign, and a genuine wave of quiet support from countless others who had silently endured Brenda Sterling's oppressive reign, seeing him as a liberator. The story of the rancher agent became a cautionary tale for overzealous HOAs everywhere. He found himself, surprisingly, less isolated than before. The Millers, their faces radiating relief, brought him a homemade apple pie, a simple gesture of profound gratitude for his intervention. The Chengs, whose young children now played freely near the newly secured boundary of the ranch, frequently sought his advice on planting native grasses to improve the local ecosystem, and even offered to help him with some fencing repairs. Eager to contribute to the preservation of the land, he began to see his neighbors not just as distant figures across the valley, but as a genuine community he had, in a profound way, helped liberate and unite. He found himself attending the occasional community barbecue, sharing stories, and feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. As the dust settled on the legal proceedings, Brenda Sterling and Richard Thompson faced severe consequences. They were indicted on multiple federal charges, their carefully cultivated reputations irrevocably destroyed, and their ill-gotten financial empires in ruins. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. They had tried to steal his land, a piece of American heritage, only to lose everything they had themselves, their freedom and their fortunes. It was a clear demonstration that the law, when wielded by those who understood it, could be a powerful equalizer against greed and corruption. In the quiet solitude of his ranch, watching the longhorns graze under the vast Colorado sky, Ethan reflected on the past few months. His double life, usually a source of careful compartmentalization and guarded secrecy, had collided head-on, forcing him to use every fiber of his professional skills and every resource at his disposal to protect his deeply personal sanctuary. It had been stressful, a constant, exhausting balancing act between his high-stakes federal cases investigating land fraud and environmental crimes across the West and the insidious, petty tyranny of the HOA. But it had also reaffirmed something fundamental and deeply resonant within him. His work as a federal land agent was, at its core, about protecting public lands, ensuring justice for those who sought to exploit them, and preserving the delicate balance of nature. But at its even deeper core, it was also about the sanctity of the land itself, the inherent right to proper stewardship, and the preservation of its natural integrity for future generations. His ranch, the Triple V, was not just a property. It was a microcosm of that larger mission, a personal embodiment of the principles he dedicated his life to upholding. It was his piece of the wild, his tangible connection to the enduring spirit of the American West. Now, with the threat vanquished and his two worlds having merged, then found their new harmonious balance, he could once again fully immerse himself in both his responsibilities. He continued his crucial work, traveling to distant corners of the American West, pursuing cunning criminals who threaten the nation's precious natural heritage. But he always returned to the Triple V, to the familiar dust beneath his boots, the whispering pines on the ridge, and the profound, comforting knowledge that his home was secure, protected not just by a deed, but by the quiet vigilance, strategic cunning, and unwavering resolve of a federal agent who knew precisely when to reveal his hand and how to make it count. The ranch stood, a silent, majestic sentinel against the ever-encroaching tide of development, a vibrant, living testament to the fact that even in the most unexpected places, justice, when fought for with quiet determination and expert skill, sometimes came wearing a badge and a worn Stetson,